Picking up where we left off yesterday, we're going to look at Incan society and religion. So, a lot of the societies or the social elites were led by a king in this society, and he can claim descent from the sun. Oftentimes, you'll see a lot of Incan art that kind of has centered around the sun. Quite important. Um, Worship of ancestors were also important. This next slide, we'll actually see a mummified child. A lot of the remains were preserved in mummified form. They actually consulted the mummies, so they would go and see their ancestors mummified and consult them for advice on things. And in fact, a lot of older mummified kings, when there was a movement from one king to another, they would have the mummified remains of the previous king there. Also, sacrifices were offered to ancestors, and they usually weren't human sacrifices. That usually wasn't something Incan society did, unlike the Mayans and the Aztecs. And they also had parades on festive occasions and celebrations. Here's an example of an Incan mummified child. You can look them up. There's mummified remains of Incans, quite a lot of them that are available archaeologically. So, aristocratic society, earlobe spools as adornment were usually held for the priestly class. If you look at a lot of images, which we'll see in our next slide, they oftentimes have these spools on their ears. When the Francisco Pizarro and the Spanish arrived, they actually referred to a lot of the priests as big ears because they have these spools kind of gauged into their ears. The priestly class led an ascetic and celibate life. So they kind of rejected worldly pleasures and things the world, a lot like some other religions we've seen, Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, even Christianity. Peasants organized into communities called ailu. So land and tools were held communally. Mandatory work details on land of aristocrats, and they also constructed massive public works. We saw previously, cities like Machu Picchu required large amounts of work and large amounts of organized labor to construct these things. Here's an example of an Incan priest. As you can see, the ear spools in his ears. This is a modern representation and like a performance they put on. So there were several gods in the pantheon of the Incan religion, but the most important was Inti, the sun god, who was above all. And it talks about a few other gods in your text on 492, but he was the most important. And people would come to Cusco, which held the cult of the sun, where thousands of priests were, devotees served Inti, and it became kind of a site of pilgrimage to Cusco for people across the Incan Empire. So bring them to the city itself. Like I said before, the peasants usually sacrificed produce and animals, not humans. Wasn't very common in Incan culture. Additionally, moral thought was kind of established in the Incan Empire, where they believed in the concept of sin, and that any violating the moral order or natural order would bring problems to society. And they actually believed in life after death, that there was a reward and punishment after, based on the quality of their earthly lives. So they had to make sure that they lived a life free of sin, because it would disrupt the divine order of the world. Now we're moving into Oceania. So the people of Oceania, if you look at your map on page 494, you can tell that these people are going to have to be foragers because they live on islands which are probably not going to be able to sustain them very much. And they couldn't have, a lot of these places, virtually all of them, had no agriculture. They weren't able to grow the types of crops you see out in the Western Hemisphere, or even the northern part of the Eastern Hemisphere, even Africa and Asia. Instead, you would see smaller amounts of cultivation in places like New Guinea, which is north of Australia. They would herd swine, so pigs, and rely on root cultivation of roots like cassava. This is around 5,000. So roots were important to their health and establishment of a food supply. So there was small-scale trade in this region as well. You would see in Australia, pearly oyster shells would be traded, spears, boomerangs would be exchanged between cultures in this region as well, across places like the Torres Strait. So you'd see exchange between New Guinea and Australia, the aboriginals of both those places. Here's an aborigine with a boomerang, modern example, from Australia, weapon for hunting. Additionally, they had cultural and religious traditions that were very much different than in other parts of the world. But before I continue to talk about this, I want to go back to the previous slide and kind of reiterate something. This trade was small scale because if you look at the map, they're not going to be able, they have vast amounts of ocean in between them in the South Pacific and the North Pacific as well. So they're unable to really trade with one another because they have to cover vast amounts of ocean, so you don't see too much exchange. They relied mostly on themselves to sustain themselves. And a lot of the populations, because they were can create abundant amounts of food, tended to be small in this region. They did rely on fish, taro, which is like a purple yam of some sort, sweet potatoes, bananas, breadfruit, coconuts, pigs, and they kept domesticated dogs as well. Carrying on to cultural and religious traditions. So the religion in this society focused on making sure that they maintain a consistent food supply, because this region definitely didn't have consistent food supplies associated with it. So as you see in page 496, a lot of the Polynesian religion focused on not only the god of war, but agriculture as well. And a lot of the religious ceremonies took place on places called mare, which were took many forms. A lot of them were timber and thatched roof. Others were outdoors in large pyramids, just depended on where it was in the world, or where it was in the Polynesian world. On. Here are the societies of Polynesia throughout the entire region. Quite a vast amount of islands and territory. Development of the Pacific Island Societies, so they established in almost all islands in early centuries, so people were living on essentially all the islands that you see on page 94 in that previous slide. So there was trade between these island groups, although limited to kind of the ones closest to them. Long distance voyaging on intermittent basis. A lot of the ships that they built couldn't go over large trans-oceanic journeys. But they did bring sweet potatoes from South America by around 300 CE. So that is, if you look at the map that you have, it's a considerable trek. Voyages were preserved in oral traditions, so you didn't have writing in these societies. So they were master mariners, but the amount they could move was fairly limited. Example of a Polynesian ship. So population growth in the societies of these places grew considerably because they started to cultivate more and grow more. So fishing innovations, fish ponds allowed for small fish to be trapped in, as you see on page 495. That's an example of a pond that they created kind of off the coast into the waters to kind of capture it and keep the fish there. Population density would lead to social strife, so that's why you see religiously kind of this focus on the god of war in this region as well, and Aboriginal people and Polynesian people focused on the gods of war because they were constantly attacking each other. So this is where you'd see kind of the advent of cannibalism after they began fighting one another extensively. 1500. So social classes, because of when populations increase, you move away from a hunter-gatherer society and you move towards a society that has high chiefs, lesser chiefs, commoners, artisans. So you see a hierarchy of people. Small multi-island empires form, so you'd see it limited before the 19th century, and yet controlled land allocation, labor, and military conscription. And we've already talked about Polynesian religion in our previous slides, but a lot of them began to see priests as intermediaries to the divine and focused on helping them to connect with nature